The first technique that I want to show you is wet into wet, making a design. So wet into wet means that we're adding wet paint onto wet paper. So the first thing I'm going to do is with my clean water, I'm going to take the area that I want to paint and I'm just going to apply some water. I'm not making it soaking wet, but I'm adding enough water that I can see a glisten on the paper. And then I'm going to choose a color. I'm going to go with a light color for this one. I'm going to pick up some yellow watercolor paint and I'm going to apply that. The advantage of using water first, a wet into wet technique, is that that paint flowed nice and smoothly through that whole area and it didn't leave the paintbrush marks. Okay, those are for detail work, but you really want to work on a wet surface with watercolors for a large area. I'm going to go ahead and rinse my brush. And then I'm going to take one of my smaller brushes and I'm going to make some designs. So I'm going to choose some red watercolor paint and I'm going to create some designs into the wet. And what you'll notice is that they will start to expand. So you can do anything. I chose spirals, but you'll see the watercolor start to diffuse and it makes like a soft kind of fuzzy pattern in your final. I'm going to go ahead and rinse that brush, set it to the side. So the next technique is to wet into wet using drops of paint. So for this one, I'm again going to start with a wet surface with some clean water. So when your water gets too dirty, you should clean that out. And I'm going to use my small brush for this one, and I'm going to use a variety of colors, and I'm just going to drop the paint into the surface, rinse my brush, change colors, and what you'll notice happening is that the watercolors will just fly off in that wet surface and they create a unique pattern. So I'm just putting little drops, but I'm still using the properties of wet paint. Now you do have to be a little bit careful as you start to use too many colors because they will mix a little bit. So as we know, purple and yellow are opposites, so even though I added those, they might mix a little bit. And blue and orange are opposites, so they might mix and make a little muddy. But with anything, you've got to experiment to learn. So you're just going to play with the different colors and it just diffuses into the water, creating this kind of explosion or polka dot effect, and you can play with adding the different colors into there. The next technique is salt. So you're going to use any wet technique that you want to start. So I'm starting again with my clean water. Then I'm going to add in my color. I'm going to choose blue for this one. And notice, because that water's on there, this color is flowing right through that area. And if I want the blue darker, I would add more paint. And if I want it lighter, I would add more water to my brush. Okay? Now, all I'm going to do to this plain blue is I'm going to sprinkle a little salt on it. And what you'll see is the salt is kind of sucking up the water around it. And it's going to create an effect that will take a minute or two here. So pay attention to that while I'm showing you the next technique. Then I'm going to do the last technique, which is a gradient. A gradient means going either from light to dark in a single color or fading from one color into another. But watercolor is great for making a gradient. You can use it for making like a sunset. You can use it for making nice shadows. So again, you're starting with that wet paper. You can't wet too much at a time because it will start to dry before you're ready. So you're going to kind of work one area at a time. Put the water on, give it a few seconds to kind of soak into the paper. And then you can go ahead with your technique. You'll notice the salt is already starting to change and those neat speckles are starting to show up. And the result will continue to grow. For this one, I'm going to fade yellow into orange. So I'm going to start with my yellow paint up at the top. And I've got a wet surface, so the paint is flowing. And I'm slowly just letting the paint come lighter because I'm not adding more paint. And if I needed to get that lighter, I could add a little more water and come back in and kind of dilute down the color a little bit. So you can see I'm already getting a fade there, but then I want to add some orange in this side. So I'm going to work with my orange this way, and I'm going to slowly blend it into the yellow so that it fades. Now notice I'm painting over some of the yellow so that I get a nice smooth effect, and I won't see any of these paintbrushes marks because the paper's wet. So it's just diffusing the paints. So that's a gradient. If you wanted to make the orange more powerful, you can come back with another layer. And it will continue to amplify the color and make it more intense. So we've got all kinds of designs you can experiment with the wet into wet technique. You can do the wet into wet drops. It's kind of like fireworks or confetti. The salt technique, you can really see how that's starting to come out. So it creates that speckled effect. It gives you great texture. Or you could do a gradient wet into wet. You can also combine these techniques. So go ahead and start experimenting. Thanks.